One of the seven wonders of the ancient world may never have existed. For more than 2,000 years, people have described terraces rising toward the sky, trees suspended above the burning desert, water flowing where water should not exist. And yet, not a single inscription from Babylon clearly mentions it. No confirmed foundation has ever been found. The most famous garden in history may be nothing more than a misunderstanding, copied, translated, and retold until it became real in the human imagination. If a wonder can survive without evidence, what does that reveal about the way history itself is constructed? Long before archaeologists placed a single shovel into the soil of Iraq, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon already existed in writing. Not in Babylonian royal records, not in clay tablets buried beneath temple foundations, but in Greek and Roman texts composed centuries after the gardens were supposedly built. The earliest thread of evidence begins not with excavation, but with storytelling. That is where our investigation must begin, because when we ask about the truth of the Hanging Gardens, we are first asking about the truth of the sources that describe them. According to later writers, a Babylonian priest named Berossus, living in the 3rd century BCE under Hellenistic rule, wrote a history of Babylonia in Greek. His original work has been lost. What survives are fragments quoted by later authors. In those fragments, it is claimed that King Nebuchadnezzar II constructed elevated gardens for his wife, who longed for the green hills of her homeland. This detail is repeated so often today that it feels solid, almost intimate. Yet the original text of Berossus is gone. We rely on Josephus and other writers who quoted him hundreds of years later. Already, the foundation beneath the garden begins to shift. Moving forward in time, Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, gives one of the most detailed surviving descriptions. He speaks of terraces rising in ascending layers, supported by massive stone columns. He describes deep layers of soil capable of sustaining large trees. He imagines an irrigation system that lifted water from the Euphrates River to the highest level. His account is vivid, but Diodorus never claims to have seen the gardens himself. He is compiling earlier sources, many of which are no longer available to us. Strabo, the Greek geographer writing around the time of Augustus, also describes the gardens. He mentions a screw-like device used to raise water. Quintus Curtius Rufus, a Roman historian, adds further texture in his narrative of Alexander the Great. Yet none of these authors lived anywhere near the time when the gardens were supposedly built in the 6th century BCE. Nebuchadnezzar II ruled between 605 and 562 BCE. Diodorus wrote roughly 5 centuries later. Strabo wrote even later. This gap matters. In historical study, the closer a source is to an event, the more cautiously we treat accounts written long afterward. The Hanging Gardens enter the historical record not as a contemporary Babylonian achievement, but as a remembered marvel filtered through Greek language and imagination. Even more striking is what these writers do not provide. No precise location within Babylon is consistently identified. Measurements vary between accounts, construction details differ. Some describe stone architecture, though stone was rare in southern Mesopotamia, where mud brick dominated. These inconsistencies do not automatically disprove the gardens. Ancient descriptions of real monuments can vary, but they remind us that our knowledge rests on literary tradition rather than direct documentation. At this early stage, the truth about the Hanging Gardens is inseparable from the nature of ancient writing itself. We are not looking at architectural blueprints. We are reading echoes, and those echoes pass through centuries of copying, translation, and interpretation before reaching us. The story begins not in the soil of Babylon, but in the pages of authors who were already looking backward in time. When historians examine the Hanging Gardens, they often return to a single fragile thread. The name Berossus. He was a Babylonian priest of Marduk, living in the early 3rd century BCE, during a time when Mesopotamia was ruled by the Seleucid dynasty, successors of Alexander the Great. Berossus wrote a history of Babylonia in Greek, likely to explain his culture to a Hellenistic audience. His work, often called the Babyloniaca, does not survive in full. It survives only in fragments quoted by later writers such as Josephus, Eusebius, and others who lived centuries after him. This layered transmission is essential to understanding the limits of our knowledge. We do not possess Berossus directly. We possess quotations of quotations. In the fragments attributed to him, Nebuchadnezzar II is credited with constructing elevated gardens for his Median wife, who missed the mountainous landscapes of her homeland. This detail has become central to the popular narrative. It humanizes the monument. It gives it emotional purpose. Yet historians must ask a careful question. How accurately do these later authors represent what Berossus actually wrote? Ancient historians did not always quote with modern precision. They paraphrased, they condensed, they interpreted. Sometimes they reshaped earlier accounts to suit their own arguments. Josephus, for example, cited Berossus while defending the antiquity and grandeur of Near Eastern civilizations. His purpose was partly apologetic. That does not make his citation false, but it reminds us that ancient texts often served rhetorical goals. Between Berossus and Josephus lies a span of roughly 3 centuries. Between Josephus and the modern reader lies nearly 2 millennia of manuscript copying. Every stage introduces the possibility of alteration, omission, or misunderstanding. The physical manuscripts we possess today are medieval copies of Roman, copies of Greek texts that themselves referred to earlier writings. This is not unusual for ancient history. It is the normal condition of our sources. But it means the Hanging Gardens enter history through a narrow and fragile channel. Another layer of complexity arises from language. Berossus wrote in Greek, not Akkadian. If he consulted older Babylonian records, we do not know exactly how he translated or summarized them. Subtle differences in terminology can reshape meaning. A word describing a temple complex garden might, in another context, suggest an elaborate terraced structure. When Greek authors encountered Mesopotamian architecture, they interpreted it through categories familiar to them. The idea of ascending terraces may have resonated with Greek experiences of stepped sanctuaries or artificial platforms. The question is not whether Berossus invented the gardens. There is no firm evidence that he did. The question is how securely we can reconstruct what he intended to describe. Because his original manuscript is lost, we cannot compare quotations against the source. We rely on later compilers who themselves lived in different political and cultural worlds. By the time Diodorus and Strabo were writing, the Near East had already been reshaped by conquest and reinterpretation. Memory had time to evolve. At this point in our investigation, the Hanging Gardens exist primarily as a literary inheritance passed through multiple generations. That inheritance may preserve genuine historical memory. It may also contain embellishment. What is clear is that the foundation of the story rests not on contemporary Babylonian inscriptions, but on texts transmitted across centuries. The truth, if it exists, is filtered through preservation. When we place the surviving descriptions of the Hanging Gardens side by side, a pattern slowly emerges. The writers agree on certain broad features. They speak of elevated terraces. They describe abundant vegetation growing above ground level. They mention an advanced system that raised water from the Euphrates, and they associate the structure with Babylon and with a powerful king, usually Nebuchadnezzar II. These shared elements create the outline of the wonder that later became fixed in cultural memory. Yet when we move beyond that outline, the details begin to shift. Diodorus Siculus describes the gardens as a square structure, each side measuring about 4 plethra, supported by stone columns and layered with reeds, bitumen, baked bricks, and lead to prevent water seepage. Strabo refers to vaulted terraces and a mechanical device for lifting water, often interpreted as a type of screw. Quintus Curtius Rufus emphasizes height and lushness, but offers fewer technical specifics. None of these accounts provide identical measurements. None specify the exact location within the city walls of Babylon. None claim eyewitness testimony. Differences in construction materials raise further questions. Southern Mesopotamia had limited natural stone. Monumental buildings in Babylon were primarily constructed from mud brick, often faced with glazed brick for decoration. The massive use of stone described by Diodorus would have required large-scale importation. That is not impossible, but it is significant. When Nebuchadnezzar II built the Ishtar Gate and reinforced Babylon's fortifications, he commemorated those achievements in detailed inscriptions. Those inscriptions survive on clay cylinders and building records. They describe walls, temples, canals, and palaces. They do not clearly mention terraced gardens of the scale later described by Greek writers. This silence does not prove absence. Royal inscriptions were selective. Kings emphasized projects that reinforced divine favor and political authority. Still, the absence of an explicit Babylonian reference to such a monumental garden remains one of the most discussed gaps in the evidence. At the same time, we should avoid overstating that silence. Archaeology in Babylon has been incomplete and complicated by later destruction, river shifts, and modern activity. Not every structure has survived, and not every inscription has been recovered. What we can say with confidence is narrower. The classical descriptions agree on the concept of elevated, irrigated greenery within or near Babylon. They disagree on specifics of structure and engineering. They derive from authors writing centuries after the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II. No surviving Babylonian text currently confirms the existence of a monument matching their accounts. By the end of this first axis, the shape of the problem is clear. The Hanging Gardens enter history through literature rather than through contemporary documentation. They are consistently described, yet inconsistently detailed. They are confidently located in Babylon by Greek and Roman authors, yet not definitively identified in the city's own surviving records. The question is no longer simply whether the gardens existed. The question is what kind of evidence would allow us to say so with confidence. Our search for truth now moves away from later writers and toward Babylon itself, toward the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, whose city would have had to sustain such a wonder if it truly stood there. By the time Nebuchadnezzar II came to power in 605 BCE, Babylon was already an ancient city, yet under his reign it became something more than ancient. It became monumental. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, at its height, stretched across much of the Near East. Trade routes flowed through its territory, tribute arrived from conquered regions, wealth accumulated. Nebuchadnezzar invested that wealth into construction on a scale that transformed the city's appearance. If the Hanging Gardens were ever built in Babylon, they would most likely belong to this period of intense architectural ambition. Archaeology confirms that Nebuchadnezzar reshaped Babylon extensively. Excavations conducted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries uncovered massive defensive walls, broad ceremonial avenues, temple complexes, and palace structures. The Ishtar Gate, with its glazed blue bricks and reliefs of lions and dragons, stands as one of the most striking examples of Mesopotamian art. The processional way extended through the city, linking sacred and political spaces. Inscriptions left by Nebuchadnezzar survive in considerable number. They describe rebuilding temples for Marduk and other gods, reinforcing fortifications, dredging canals, and enlarging palaces. These inscriptions follow a recognizable pattern. The king presents himself as chosen by the gods, restoring order and splendor. He names specific projects. He details materials. He records dimensions. In several cylinders and foundation deposits, he speaks proudly of raising walls so high that enemies would tremble at their sight. He describes strengthening embankments along the Euphrates. He documents canal works designed to regulate water and improve agriculture. Water management was central to Mesopotamian survival. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates depended on irrigation networks that had developed over millennia. Babylon itself was interwoven with canals. The Euphrates ran through the city, dividing it. Bridges and quays connected districts. Managing seasonal floods required engineering skill and administrative coordination. In this environment, the idea of irrigated greenery was not foreign. Gardens existed in Mesopotamian culture long before Nebuchadnezzar. Royal inscriptions from Assyria describe orchards and pleasure gardens stocked with exotic trees. Relief carvings from Nineveh show carefully arranged landscapes near palaces. Greenery symbolized control over nature and divine favor. It also represented abundance in a climate where water determined life. What remains striking, however, is that among the many inscriptions attributed to Nebuchadnezzar II, none explicitly describe a vast terraced garden rising above the city. He records palace expansions and speaks of planting trees in certain contexts, but no surviving text clearly matches the dramatic multi-level structure described by later Greek authors. This silence forms a central tension in modern scholarship. Nebuchadnezzar documented walls, gates, temples, canals, and palaces with pride. If he had constructed one of the 7 wonders of the world, would he not have recorded it? Historians approach that question cautiously. Royal inscriptions were formulaic and selective. They emphasized what reinforced kingship and piety. It is possible that a garden, even an elaborate one, was considered an extension of palace grounds rather than a separate monument requiring detailed commemoration. It is also possible that relevant inscriptions have not survived. Clay tablets break, buildings collapse. Time removes evidence unevenly. At this stage, what we can say with confidence is limited but clear. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar II possessed the wealth, administrative organization, and engineering capacity to undertake large-scale construction. The city was architecturally impressive by any standard of the ancient world. If a monumental garden existed there, it would have stood within a city already defined by grandeur. Yet the surviving Babylonian record does not explicitly confirm the structure described centuries later by Greek writers. The investigation therefore narrows. To understand the truth about the Hanging Gardens, we must examine not only what Babylon built, but what its own builders chose to remember in writing. Nebuchadnezzar II left behind more building inscriptions than any other Neo-Babylonian ruler. These texts were not casual remarks. They were carefully composed declarations, pressed into clay cylinders or carved into stone, then buried within foundations or displayed in visible places. Their purpose was both practical and symbolic. Practically, they recorded construction. Symbolically, they linked the king's authority to the gods, especially Marduk, patron deity of Babylon. When we read these inscriptions today, we are reading what Nebuchadnezzar wanted future generations and the gods to remember about his reign. He repeatedly describes rebuilding the Esagila temple, restoring the ziggurat Etemenanki, strengthening the inner and outer city walls known as Imgur-Enlil and Nimiti-Enlil, and expanding his royal palace. He speaks of cedar beams imported from Lebanon, of precious metals adorning gates, of brick kilns operating at scale. He gives dimensions, he names materials, he invokes divine approval. In several texts, he refers to gardens in a general sense, mentioning planted trees or pleasant surroundings near palace structures. But these references remain brief and conventional. They do not describe a towering, multi-terraced construction with complex irrigation mechanisms. This distinction matters. Royal gardens were not unusual in Mesopotamia. Assyrian kings before Nebuchadnezzar had created elaborate landscaped parks stocked with trees gathered from conquered lands. Sennacherib of Assyria described planting orchards and constructing water channels to irrigate them. Relief carvings from Nineveh depict terraced landscapes near palaces with trees arranged in deliberate patterns. These were statements of imperial reach. The king could gather plants from distant regions and make them flourish at the heart of his capital. Within this broader Near Eastern tradition, a garden in Babylon would not have been extraordinary. What would have been extraordinary is the scale described by later Greek authors, ascending terraces high enough to appear suspended, capable of supporting mature trees above the ground. If such a structure stood beside Nebuchadnezzar's palace, its engineering would have required careful planning, waterproofing, and constant water supply. It would have been an achievement equal in complexity to major fortifications. Yet the surviving inscriptions that celebrate engineering triumphs do not clearly describe it. Some historians suggest caution in drawing conclusions from absence. The genre of royal inscriptions followed established formulas. Kings emphasized temple restoration because temple maintenance affirmed divine order. They highlighted fortifications because walls symbolized security. A pleasure garden, even a grand one, may not have fit the rhetorical pattern they preferred. Moreover, not all inscriptions have survived. Excavations in Babylon have been interrupted by political instability, environmental change, and modern construction. Portions of the ancient city remain unexplored. However, the contrast remains noticeable. Nebuchadnezzar carefully detailed projects that enhanced his prestige. He described raising palace terraces and strengthening embankments along the Euphrates. If a monumental garden existed as later described, it would likely have required substantial structural support and water management features that might reasonably appear in such records. At this point in our investigation, we are left with a balanced but unresolved picture. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar possessed established traditions of royal landscaping. The technological foundation for irrigation existed. Yet the king's own commemorative voice does not explicitly confirm the existence of the hanging gardens as portrayed in classical accounts. The silence is not proof, but it is part of the evidence. To move closer to clarity, we must next examine whether the engineering described by Greek writers was technically possible within the environmental and technological conditions of 6th century BCE Mesopotamia. Babylon was not built in a barren wasteland. It stood within a fertile alluvial plain shaped by the Euphrates River. Seasonal flooding deposited rich silt across the surrounding land, supporting agriculture on a scale large enough to sustain one of the great cities of the ancient world. Wheat, barley, date palms, and various fruits were cultivated through irrigation systems that had evolved over centuries. Canals branched from the Euphrates and were regulated by gates and embankments. In this sense, water was not absent from Babylon. It was carefully managed. This environmental context is essential when evaluating whether a large, irrigated garden could function within the city. The Greek and Roman descriptions emphasize water being lifted upward, sometimes by mechanical means, to nourish elevated terraces. To assess this realistically, we must consider what technologies were available in the 6th century BCE. Simple water-lifting devices such as shadoofs, counterweighted poles with buckets, were known in the ancient Near East and Egypt. These could raise water from a lower to a slightly higher level, especially for irrigation along riverbanks. More complex systems, such as chain pumps or screw-like devices, are debated in terms of their exact dates. The device, often called the Archimedean screw, is traditionally associated with the 3rd century BCE, though some scholars argue that similar mechanisms may have existed earlier in Mesopotamia. The evidence remains inconclusive. What is clear is that Mesopotamian engineers were capable of large-scale hydraulic projects. They constructed canals stretching for kilometers. They controlled river flow with embankments. They maintained irrigation networks requiring coordinated labor. If water needed to be raised several meters to irrigate palace gardens, that challenge would not have been beyond their organizational capacity. The greater difficulty lies in the height, described by some classical accounts. Supporting deep layers of soil capable of sustaining mature trees on high terraces would require strong substructures and careful waterproofing. Diodorus describes layers of reeds, bitumen, bricks, and lead to prevent leakage. Bitumen was indeed widely used in Mesopotamia as a waterproofing material. Reeds were abundant in marshlands. Mud brick construction techniques were highly developed. From a purely technical perspective, constructing elevated platforms with protective layers is plausible. The question becomes one of scale and maintenance. A garden rising dramatically above ground level would demand continuous water lifting, day after day, in a hot climate with high evaporation. That implies sustained labor and mechanical reliability. It does not make the project impossible, but it frames it as an ongoing system rather than a static monument. When Greek writers described water flowing downward from upper terraces, they may have been observing or imagining a complex irrigation cascade. Yet no Babylonian engineering manual describing such a structure has been recovered. Archaeological remains of irrigation channels exist throughout Mesopotamia, but none have been definitively identified as belonging to a massive terraced garden in Babylon itself. At this stage, the engineering question does not eliminate the possibility of the hanging gardens. The materials and hydraulic knowledge required were within the broader capabilities of the region. However, feasibility alone does not confirm existence. Many structures are possible in theory, fewer are documented in practice. As we move forward, the focus must shift from environmental and technological capacity to physical evidence on the ground, excavations that attempted to locate the gardens within the ruins of Babylon. By the late 19th century, the question of the hanging gardens began to shift from the pages of classical texts to the soil of Mesopotamia. European interest in the ancient Near East had intensified. Archaeology was emerging as a more systematic discipline. Among the most significant figures in the exploration of Babylon was the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey, who began large-scale excavations at the site in 1899 under the sponsorship of the German Oriental Society. His work would continue for more than a decade, gradually revealing the physical outline of Nebuchadnezzar's city. Koldewey approached Babylon methodically. He mapped fortification walls, uncovered sections of the processional way, and identified the remains of palaces and temples described in ancient inscriptions. One of his most celebrated discoveries was the Ishtar Gate, whose glazed bricks were later reconstructed and displayed in Berlin. These findings confirmed that the literary descriptions of Babylon's grandeur were not exaggerated fantasies. The city had indeed been monumental. For those searching for the hanging gardens, this confirmation was encouraging. If the walls and gates described by ancient writers were real, perhaps the gardens were waiting beneath the surface as well. During his excavations near the southern palace complex, Koldewey uncovered a series of vaulted rooms built from stone and brick with thick walls and what appeared to be deep foundation structures. This was unusual. Stone was not commonly used in large quantities in southern Mesopotamia, making the discovery stand out. Nearby, he identified a well-like shaft and passages that he interpreted as part of a water-lifting system. Based on the classical descriptions, particularly Diodorus's mention of vaulted terraces and waterproofed layers, Koldewey proposed that these remains might represent the substructure of the hanging gardens. His identification gained attention. For a time, it seemed that archaeology had finally caught up with legend. The logic was understandable. The structure lay within the palace district, where one might expect a royal garden. The vaulting suggested support for heavy loads above. The presence of shafts hinted at water management. In the early 20th century, Koldewey's interpretation was widely accepted in popular accounts. The hanging gardens appeared to have been found. Yet, archaeology rarely ends with a single conclusion. As further analysis developed, doubts began to surface. Later, scholars questioned whether the vaulted building was strong enough to support massive terraces filled with soil and mature trees. Others suggested that the structure may have functioned as a storage facility, perhaps for administrative or military purposes. The nearby water shafts might have been part of a different hydraulic installation unrelated to gardens. No direct botanical remains, such as pollen concentrations consistent with large-scale tree planting, were definitively linked to the structure. More importantly, no inscription at the site identified the building as a garden. Unlike temples and gates, which often bore dedicatory texts, this complex provided no clear label tying it to the wonder described by Greek authors. As excavation techniques improved over the 20th century, scholars reassessed earlier interpretations with greater caution. Koldewey had uncovered a significant and unusual structure. That much remains undisputed. What remains uncertain is whether that structure corresponds to the hanging gardens of classical tradition. The excitement of discovery gradually gave way to careful re-evaluation. The soil of Babylon had revealed many truths about the city's architecture. but it had not provided an unmistakable signature reading. Here stood the garden in the air. The search, therefore, continued, now shaped by both archaeological evidence and the growing awareness of how easily hope can guide interpretation. As the 20th century progressed, the initial confidence surrounding Robert Calderway's identification of the vaulted structure began to soften. Archaeology matured as a discipline. Methods became more precise. Structural analysis grew more technical. Scholars returned to Calderway's excavation reports and asked a simple but demanding question. Could this building truly have supported what the classical writers described? The vaulted rooms uncovered near the southern palace were impressive, but their dimensions did not perfectly match the measurements provided by Diodorus Siculus. The thickness of the walls suggested strength, yet calculations indicated limits. Supporting several meters of soil saturated with water and mature trees with deep root systems would require extraordinary load-bearing capacity. Some engineers examining the remains argued that the vaults, while substantial, were unlikely to sustain the enormous weight implied by a multi-level terraced garden. Another issue concerned waterproofing. Diodorus described layers of reeds, bitumen, brick, and even lead sheets designed to prevent water from seeping into lower levels. Bitumen was indeed common in Mesopotamian construction, and waterproofing techniques were well known. However, direct archaeological evidence of extensive waterproof layers in the excavated structure was not conclusively demonstrated. Without clear traces of such protective systems, the identification became less secure. The shafts that Calderway interpreted as part of a water-lifting mechanism also came under scrutiny. Their configuration did not unambiguously indicate a continuous vertical irrigation system. Some researchers propose that these installations may have served more routine purposes, possibly related to storage or drainage within the palace complex. In large ancient cities, complex subsurface architecture was not unusual. Not every unusual structure was necessarily a wonder of the world. Location presented another complication. The classical accounts are not consistent about where exactly the gardens stood within Babylon. Calderway's structure lay in one section of the palace district, yet other areas of the city remained only partially excavated. If the Greek descriptions were based on distorted memory, they might not correspond neatly to any surviving foundation. In addition, geological changes over centuries, shifts in the Euphrates course, erosion, later building activity, could have altered or destroyed portions of the ancient landscape. Absence of confirmation does not automatically equal proof of absence. Yet, archaeology relies on material patterns. When monumental structures such as temples or gates are discovered, they tend to leave unmistakable signatures, inscriptions, distinctive layouts, consistent architectural features. The vaulted complex lacked such confirming markers. No dedicatory inscription identified it as a garden. No botanical remains clearly indicated extensive tree growth above. Over time, the majority of scholars concluded that Calderway's identification, while imaginative and understandable given the evidence available to him, was not sufficiently supported by physical proof. The structure he uncovered remains important, but its function is still debated. By the mid-20th century, academic consensus had largely shifted away from locating the Hanging Gardens at that specific site. This shift did not resolve the mystery. Instead, it reopened it. If the gardens were not there, where were they? Or had later writers misunderstood something entirely? The soil of Babylon had been examined carefully, yet it had not yielded a structure that convincingly matched the literary descriptions. As doubts grew, some researchers began to look beyond Babylon itself, reconsidering whether the classical authors might have misplaced the wonder geographically. The investigation was about to move northward. As confidence in locating the Hanging Gardens within Babylon weakened, the direction of inquiry gradually shifted. If excavations in the traditional capital of Nebuchadnezzar II had not revealed a structure matching the classical descriptions, scholars faced two possibilities. Either the gardens once existed there but left no clear trace, or the ancient writers had associated the wonder with the wrong city. The second possibility began to attract serious attention in the late 20th century. The turning point in this discussion came from a closer reading of Assyrian sources, particularly those from the reign of Sennacherib, who ruled from 704 to 681 BCE, more than a century before Nebuchadnezzar II. Sennacherib made Nineveh, in northern Mesopotamia, the capital of the Assyrian Empire. Like Nebuchadnezzar, he was an ambitious builder. Unlike the surviving Babylonian inscriptions regarding the gardens, Sennacherib's records describe in remarkable detail a vast system of waterworks constructed to supply his city. These included canals, aqueducts, and sluice gates extending across significant distances. One inscription even boasts of bringing water over mountains and valleys to create a wonder for all peoples. Relief carvings discovered in Nineveh depict lush gardens associated with the royal palace. These images show terraced landscapes with trees growing at different elevations, irrigated by flowing water. The scenes are stylized, as ancient art often was, but they provide direct visual evidence that elaborate royal gardens existed in Assyria. Some scholars have argued that these Assyrian gardens, rather than anything in Babylon, align more closely with the Greek descriptions. The engineering feats recorded by Sennacherib include aqueducts built of stone blocks, an unusual material choice in Mesopotamian architecture, but one clearly documented in his inscriptions. The Jerwan Aqueduct, for example, stands as one of the earliest known large-scale stone aqueducts in history. Its existence demonstrates both technical capacity and ambition. If a monumental irrigated garden existed in Nineveh, it would not contradict the archaeological record there. This line of reasoning leads to a provocative question. Could later Greek writers have confused Nineveh with Babylon? In antiquity, the term Babylon sometimes functioned symbolically, referring broadly to Mesopotamian power rather than strictly to the southern city. By the time Greek historians were writing, both Assyrian and Babylonian empires were part of a layered historical memory. It is conceivable that accounts of an Assyrian garden became attached to the more famous name of Babylon over time. This hypothesis does not claim certainty. It proposes relocation rather than invention. Instead of dismissing the gardens as myth, it suggests that their physical counterpart may have stood in a different capital. Yet this theory also faces limits. The classical authors explicitly place the gardens in Babylon, and none clearly attribute them to Nineveh. Moreover, the chronological gap between Sennacherib and the Greek writers remains significant. As in the Babylonian case, we are interpreting texts filtered through centuries of transmission. By the end of this axis, the investigation has become more complex rather than less. Archaeology in Babylon has not confirmed the gardens as traditionally described. Assyrian evidence in Nineveh reveals sophisticated royal gardens and advanced water systems. The possibility emerges that the wonder was mislocated in later retellings. Whether misplaced, misunderstood, or remembered imperfectly, the Hanging Gardens now stand at the intersection of two great Mesopotamian capitals. The search for truth must continue by examining the Assyrian evidence in greater detail, asking whether Nineveh truly offers a stronger foundation for the legend than Babylon ever did. When scholars turned their attention to Nineveh, they did not begin with speculation. They began with inscriptions carved by Sennacherib himself. Unlike the uncertain fragments attributed to Berossus, Sennacherib's records survive in substantial form. They were inscribed on clay prisms and cylinders, buried in palace foundations, and preserved in multiple copies. These texts describe his construction projects with unusual technical detail. In them, the Assyrian king presents himself not only as a conqueror, but as a master of engineering. One inscription recounts how he diverted water from distant sources to supply Nineveh. He describes cutting canals through rocky terrain and building aqueducts of stone to carry water across valleys. The most famous of these structures, the aqueduct at Jerwan, has been excavated and studied. It consists of large stone blocks carefully fitted together, forming a raised channel that once transported water toward the capital. An inscription carved into the stone names Sennacherib and commemorates the project. This is not legend, it is physically verifiable infrastructure. Sennacherib also refers to creating a palace without rival, surrounded by gardens planted with a wide variety of trees. He lists species gathered from across the empire, fruit trees, aromatic woods, plants from mountainous regions. The language conveys deliberate design. He claims to have imitated the landscapes of distant lands within the heart of his city. Relief carvings discovered in the palace at Nineveh visually reinforce these claims. Some panels depict elevated garden scenes with flowing water, trees arranged in terraces, and structures integrated into the landscape. Water appears to cascade from one level to another. While ancient art cannot be read as a photograph, it does show that Assyrian rulers associated themselves with controlled, abundant greenery supported by engineered water systems. When compared to the classical descriptions of the hanging gardens, certain parallels emerge. Greek writers speak of terraces supported by substantial substructures. They describe water raised mechanically and distributed across upper levels. They emphasize the visual effect of greenery rising above an otherwise dry environment. In Nineveh, we find documented aqueducts, evidence of large-scale irrigation works, and artistic depictions of terraced gardens attached to a royal palace. The chronological gap between Sennacherib's reign and the Greek authors remains, but the physical evidence in Assyria is more concrete than what has been found in Babylon. It demonstrates that a Near Eastern king before Nebuchadnezzar possessed both the ambition and the technical capacity to construct elaborate irrigated gardens on an impressive scale. This does not prove that the hanging gardens were located in Nineveh. No surviving Assyrian inscription uses the specific phrase later translated as hanging gardens. The Greek term, often rendered as hanging, may also mean overhanging or terraced. Still, the convergence between Sennacherib's documented projects and the features described centuries later invites careful consideration. If a monumental, irrigated garden once astonished visitors in northern Mesopotamia, memory of it could have traveled westward through trade, diplomacy, or storytelling. By the time Greek historians compiled their accounts, the political geography of the region had shifted repeatedly. Names and capitals changed. What endured were impressions of grandeur. The investigation now stands between two cities: Babylon, whose fame dominated classical imagination, and Nineveh, whose archaeological remains reveal sophisticated water engineering and royal gardens. To move forward, we must examine how easily ancient geographic identities could blur in transmission across languages and generations. By the time Greek historians began writing about Mesopotamia, the political map of the region had already shifted many times. The Assyrian Empire had risen and fallen. Babylon had been destroyed and rebuilt. The Persian Empire had absorbed both. Alexander the Great had conquered the region in the 4th century BCE, and after his death, his successors governed vast territories that blended cultures and languages. In this layered landscape, memory did not always preserve precise boundaries. Cities that had once been rivals could become intertwined in storytelling. Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, fell in 612 BCE, destroyed by a coalition that included the Babylonians. Its political identity faded. Babylon, by contrast, continued to occupy a central place in imperial administration under the Persians and later under Hellenistic rule. For Greek visitors and writers, Babylon was the visible and functioning symbol of Mesopotamian antiquity. When they described marvels of the East, Babylon often served as the representative name. This habit may have encouraged simplification. A wonder associated originally with an Assyrian king in Nineveh could, over generations, become attached to the more famous Babylon. Linguistic factors add another layer of complexity. Greek authors translated foreign place names and titles into forms familiar to their audiences. They relied on interpreters, earlier reports, and oral accounts. In some cases, Babylon appears in classical texts as a broad reference to the lands of Mesopotamia rather than strictly to the southern city founded long before. When Strabo or Diodorus wrote about Babylon, they were writing centuries after the fall of Nineveh, drawing upon sources that may themselves have blended traditions. There is also the matter of imperial succession. After the Assyrian Empire collapsed, Babylon inherited much of its former territory. Monuments, stories, and engineering achievements from earlier periods may have continued to circulate within shared cultural memory. Without precise historical methods to separate eras, later narrators might attribute impressive works to the best-known king or city in the region. Nebuchadnezzar II, renowned for his building campaigns and military victories, provided a compelling figure to whom such a marvel could be assigned. The classical world tended to frame history around prominent rulers and capitals. A monumental garden attached to a powerful king fit that narrative pattern. Moreover, the emotional detail preserved in later accounts, the idea that the garden was built for a queen longing for her mountainous homeland, carries a literary quality. It humanizes power. Whether historically accurate or not, such a story would have traveled easily across generations. If an Assyrian garden once astonished visitors with elevated terraces and flowing water, that visual memory might survive even if its precise location faded. Over time, the association could shift toward Babylon, the city most recognized by Greek audiences, yet caution remains essential. There is no surviving Greek text that explicitly says, "This garden stood in Nineveh, but is often mistaken for Babylon." The relocation hypothesis is an attempt to reconcile stronger Assyrian evidence with classical descriptions traditionally linked to Babylon. It is an interpretive solution, not a documented correction. What it demonstrates most clearly is how fragile geographic memory can be across centuries. As we continue, the question broadens. The Hanging Gardens may represent not a simple case of existence or non-existence, but a case of transformation where engineering, memory, translation, and political change combined to reshape a monument's identity. To understand that transformation fully, we must look more closely at how ancient texts were copied, translated, and interpreted long after the empires that built these cities had disappeared. The Nineveh hypothesis offers something the traditional Babylonian location struggles to provide: direct archaeological evidence of large-scale water engineering and visual representations of terraced royal gardens from the correct general region and era. Sennacherib's inscriptions describe canals cut through stone, aqueducts spanning valleys, and water brought deliberately into palace grounds. The Jerwan aqueduct still stands in fragmentary form, its stone blocks bearing the king's name. Relief panels from his palace show elevated greenery, water flowing in controlled channels, and trees arranged in deliberate tiers. These are not later literary echoes. They are contemporary records carved in stone. For many historians, this convergence strengthens the possibility that the memory preserved by Greek writers may reflect an Assyrian achievement rather than a Babylonian one. Yet, even this hypothesis must be approached with restraint. The classical authors consistently name Babylon as the location of the Hanging Gardens. They associate the structure with Nebuchadnezzar II, not Sennacherib. The chronological gap remains significant. Sennacherib ruled in the early 7th century BCE. Diodorus, Strabo, and others wrote between the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE. Between them lie centuries of political upheaval, conquest, and textual transmission. To accept the Nineveh hypothesis fully would require assuming that Greek historians inherited a tradition that had already shifted geographically before reaching them. That is plausible, but it is not directly documented. There is also the matter of scale. The reliefs from Nineveh depict impressive gardens, but interpreting artistic representation as architectural blueprint carries risk. Ancient art emphasizes symbolic meaning. Terraces in relief may not indicate massive, multi-story platforms comparable to those described in later texts. They may represent landscape slopes or elevated courtyards integrated into palace complexes. The Jerwan aqueduct demonstrates technical capacity, yet it does not confirm the existence of a singular monument equivalent to one of the seven wonders. What the Nineveh evidence provides is context, proof that Mesopotamian kings constructed elaborate, irrigated royal gardens and possessed the engineering skill to transport water across challenging terrain. It narrows the gap between imagination and possibility. It also reminds us that monumental achievements in this region did not belong exclusively to Babylon. Assyria and Babylonia shared cultural and technological traditions across centuries. In evaluating the strengths and limits of this theory, historians often return to the same careful balance. Babylon offers literary consistency but weak archaeological confirmation. Nineveh offers strong engineering evidence but lacks explicit classical attribution. Neither city provides a complete alignment with every surviving description. Instead of resolving the question, the Nineveh hypothesis reframes it. It shifts the focus from a simple yes or no answer toward a broader inquiry. How do monuments move through memory? How does an engineering achievement in one capital become associated with another in later storytelling? At this stage, the Hanging Gardens stand between two plausible settings, neither fully confirmed, neither fully dismissed. The investigation must now move beyond geography alone and consider the deeper mechanisms that shape historical transmission, translation, copying, reinterpretation, and the human tendency to simplify complex pasts into recognizable symbols. Only by examining those mechanisms can we understand how a garden, whether in Babylon or Nineveh, became fixed as one of the seven wonders of the world. Long before modern historians compared excavation reports, the image of the Hanging Gardens had already been shaped by translation. The earliest surviving detailed descriptions come to us in Greek, not in Akkadian, the language spoken in Babylon and Assyria. That fact alone introduces distance. When Greek writers described Mesopotamian architecture, they did so through their own vocabulary, categories, and expectations. Words that seem precise to us today may have carried broader or slightly different meanings in antiquity. The term often translated as hanging is one example. The Greek word kremastos can mean suspended, overhanging, or simply elevated. It does not necessarily imply plants dangling in mid-air. It can refer to terraces projecting outward or gardens rising above ground level. Over centuries of translation into Latin and then into modern languages, overhanging terraces became hanging gardens, a phrase that sounds more dramatic and visually extreme. A subtle shift in meaning can reshape imagination. Translation also affected place names. Mesopotamian cities passed through multiple linguistic systems: Akkadian, Aramaic, Old Persian, Greek. Each transformation altered pronunciation and sometimes identification. A story told orally in one language might be recorded in another with adjustments that made sense to a new audience. When Greek historians wrote about Babylon, they were describing a city already filtered through imperial and cultural change. If earlier traditions had blended Assyrian and Babylonian achievements, translation could reinforce that blending rather than correct it. Copying practices further complicated matters. Ancient texts were reproduced by hand. Scribes copied manuscripts line by line, sometimes adding clarifications, sometimes harmonizing conflicting passages. Marginal notes could enter the main body of text in later copies. Over generations, small interpretive decisions accumulated. A description of terraced landscaping could gradually take on more architectural specificity. A mention of royal gardens could expand into a monumental engineering achievement. None of this requires deliberate invention. It reflects the normal evolution of texts, transmitted across centuries without printing technology. The compilers of the Seven Wonders list also played a role. By the Hellenistic period, travelers and writers sought to catalogue the most astonishing constructions of the known world. These lists were not purely archaeological surveys. They reflected admiration, cultural exchange, and literary tradition. A grand garden rising above a Mesopotamian capital fit perfectly within that framework. It represented mastery over nature, technical ingenuity, and exotic splendor. Once included in the canonical list of wonders, the garden's status solidified. Later writers repeated the description because it had already become authoritative. In this process, uncertainty tends to fade while narrative clarity grows stronger. When modern readers encounter consistent classical references to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, it can feel as though the monument stands on firm historical ground. Yet that consistency may result from repetition rather than independent confirmation. Multiple authors drawing from shared earlier sources can create the appearance of agreement even when all depend on a single fragile tradition. At this point in our investigation, the Hanging Gardens exist not only as a question of archaeology or geography, but as a case study in how language preserves and reshapes memory. The movement from Akkadian reality to Greek description to modern translation spans more than 2,000 years. Within that span, meaning can shift quietly. To approach the truth, we must continue tracing how ancient compilers constructed the image of the wonder, and why certain details endured while others disappeared. By the Hellenistic period, the Mediterranean world had developed a taste for cataloguing marvels. Travel had expanded under the conquests of Alexander the Great and the networks that followed. Greek-speaking elites encountered monuments far beyond their traditional homelands. Egyptian pyramids, massive statues, fortified walls, temple complexes, engineered harbors. Out of this widening horizon emerged lists of the most astonishing constructions known to them. These lists were not standardized at first. Different authors named slightly different wonders. Over time, however, a familiar group of 7 became widely repeated: the Great Pyramid of Giza, the statue of Zeus at Olympia, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The number 7 carried symbolic weight in Greek culture, often associated with completeness. Inclusion in such a list conferred permanence. The Hanging Gardens entered this tradition not because archaeologists confirmed them, but because writers found them worthy of admiration. Within the logic of the 7 wonders, the gardens offered something distinct. Other wonders emphasized scale, height, or sculptural achievement. The gardens represented the transformation of environment itself. To Mediterranean observers accustomed to rocky hills and seasonal greenery, the idea of lush terraces rising above a Mesopotamian city carried a sense of deliberate defiance against climate. Water lifted upward in a dry landscape symbolized technical mastery. A garden, suspended above ground, suggested control over nature's limits. Whether precisely accurate or not, this image resonated deeply with the aesthetic values of the time. Once the gardens were embedded within the 7 wonders tradition, repetition reinforced belief. Later authors did not always investigate their existence independently. They cited earlier authorities. A wonder mentioned by Diodorus and Strabo gained legitimacy through citation alone. Over generations, the garden's inclusion in the canonical list became self-sustaining. Its status did not depend on fresh verification. It depended on continuity of literary tradition. This dynamic helps explain how a monument with limited archaeological confirmation could remain one of the most famous structures of the ancient world. The 7 wonders list functioned partly as education, partly as cultural identity. It taught readers about the breadth of human achievement. Removing a wonder from that list would disrupt the symmetry and narrative coherence that had developed around it. The Hanging Gardens fit thematically. They balanced the desert pyramid of Egypt with a cultivated oasis of Mesopotamia. They complemented statues and temples with living vegetation shaped by engineering. In this context, the garden's symbolic power may have outweighed precise documentation. That does not mean it was invented. It means its role within the list strengthened its endurance, regardless of evidentiary gaps. As manuscripts were copied and recopied through late antiquity and the medieval period, the 7 wonders list remained a stable cultural reference point. Students encountered it, scholars commented on it, artists illustrated it. Each repetition solidified the garden's place in collective memory. By the time modern archaeology began excavating Babylon and Nineveh, the idea of the Hanging Gardens had already become inseparable from the identity of ancient grandeur. To question their existence was to question a tradition nearly 2,000 years old. Understanding this cultural framework is essential. The gardens were not preserved in memory by accident. They survived because they fulfilled an intellectual and aesthetic need within the classical imagination. The next step in our inquiry is to examine how later historians and medieval scholars transmitted this tradition further, often without access to the lands where the gardens were said to stand. After the classical world entered late antiquity, the survival of ancient knowledge depended increasingly on preservation rather than observation. The great libraries of the Mediterranean changed hands. Political centers shifted. Travel between Europe and Mesopotamia became more limited for centuries. Yet the Seven Wonders list endured. It survived because texts survived. Greek works were copied in the Byzantine world. Latin authors preserved portions of earlier accounts in Western Europe. Meanwhile, scholars in the Islamic Golden Age translated and studied Greek scientific and historical writings, often with great care. Through these parallel traditions, the Hanging Gardens continued to exist in manuscripts even as their physical setting lay far beyond direct access for most readers. Medieval writers did not excavate Babylon. They inherited descriptions. When they reproduced lists of wonders, they relied on authorities such as Diodorus, Strabo, and later compilers who had already canonized the gardens. Over time, illustrations began to accompany these texts. Artists imagined what terraced gardens might look like, often drawing from architectural forms familiar in their own environments. In some medieval manuscripts, the gardens appear as stacked arcades covered in greenery. In others, they resemble European castle walls adorned with vines. These images were not archaeological reconstructions. They were visual interpretations shaped by contemporary imagination. Each illustration reinforced the garden's apparent solidity. The more often it was drawn, the more tangible it seemed. At the same time, Islamic scholars preserved geographical and historical works that included references to Babylon and Mesopotamia. Although many focused more on astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy, the broader transmission of classical texts ensured that the wonder remained part of learned discourse. The city of Babylon itself gradually declined in physical prominence, but its symbolic power endured in religious and literary traditions. In biblical literature, Babylon represented empire and moral warning. In classical lists, it represented architectural splendor. These layered identities strengthened the association between the city and extraordinary achievements. By the time European explorers and scholars began traveling more extensively through the Near East in the early modern period, the Hanging Gardens were already accepted as historical fact in educated circles. Their existence was rarely questioned. The authority of ancient authors carried weight. The fact that physical ruins were not immediately visible did not automatically generate doubt. Many ancient structures had been lost or buried. Absence on the surface did not negate presence in texts. What changed in the 19th century was not the description of the gardens, but the method of verification. Archaeology introduced a new standard. Instead of trusting transmitted authority alone, scholars began demanding material evidence. Excavation became a tool for testing tradition. The Hanging Gardens, long secure within manuscript culture, suddenly faced a different form of scrutiny. Their endurance through medieval transmission demonstrates something important about historical memory. Once embedded in authoritative texts and reinforced by repetition, an idea can persist across civilizations. The gardens were not forgotten during centuries when Babylon itself lay in ruins. They survived because copying preserved them. That preservation, however, also insulated them from challenge. As we move forward, the focus must shift to the modern era, when archaeological methods and critical historiography began to ask whether the manuscripts had preserved a monument or a misunderstanding. When modern historians approach the Hanging Gardens, they do so with tools and expectations very different from those of ancient compilers. Classical authors valued authority and reputation. Medieval scholars valued preservation. Modern historical method, by contrast, asks structured questions about evidence, proximity, material confirmation, and internal consistency. It separates literary testimony from archaeological verification and treats each according to its strengths and limits. This shift in method is essential to understanding why the gardens, long accepted as fact, became a subject of debate. One central principle in modern historiography is source criticism. Historians examine who wrote a text, when it was written, what sources the author may have used, and what motives shape the narrative. In the case of the Hanging Gardens, the earliest detailed descriptions come from authors writing centuries after the supposed construction. That temporal gap does not invalidate their testimony, but it lowers its certainty. A historian distinguishes between contemporary documentation and retrospective compilation. The difference is not about trust alone, it concerns how memory changes over time. Archaeology adds another layer. Unlike literature, which transmits narrative, archaeology studies physical remains. It asks whether the ground preserves structures consistent with textual claims. In Babylon, extensive excavation has revealed walls, temples, gates, and palaces. These discoveries confirm many aspects of classical descriptions about the city's grandeur. Yet no structure has been universally accepted as the Hanging Gardens. In Nineveh, waterworks and reliefs confirm advanced irrigation and royal landscaping. Still, no inscription explicitly names a wonder equivalent to the later Greek accounts. Modern standards require convergence. When text and material evidence align independently, confidence increases. When one exists without the other, caution grows. Another principle involves evaluating silence. The absence of a reference in contemporary inscriptions does not automatically disprove an event or structure. Many aspects of ancient life went unrecorded. However, when a king such as Nebuchadnezzar II documented his building achievements in detail, historians reasonably note what is missing from those records. The silence becomes part of the dataset, neither conclusive nor irrelevant. Technological feasibility also enters modern analysis. Engineers and architects assess whether the described construction methods align with known materials and techniques of the period. In the case of the gardens, raising water and supporting terraces were within Mesopotamian capabilities, but scaling them to the dramatic heights described in later texts introduces logistical questions. Feasibility supports possibility. It does not confirm actuality. What emerges from this methodological shift is not a simple rejection of tradition, but a recalibration of certainty. In antiquity, repetition across respected authors created authority. In modern scholarship, independent evidence creates authority. The Hanging Gardens stand at the intersection of these two standards. They are deeply rooted in literary tradition, yet materially elusive. This does not diminish their cultural significance. It clarifies the nature of the question. We are no longer asking whether ancient writers believed in the gardens. That belief is well documented. We are asking whether belief corresponds to a specific, identifiable structure. To answer that, historians must continue applying consistent criteria across both Babylon and Nineveh, weighing what can be demonstrated against what can only be inferred. When modern scholars classify the Hanging Gardens, they rarely speak in absolute terms. Instead of declaring the monument simply real or unreal, they describe degrees of probability. Academic discussions often fall into four broad positions. The first holds that the gardens likely existed in Babylon but have not yet been conclusively identified archaeologically. Supporters of this view argue that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Babylon remains only partially excavated. River movement, erosion, and centuries of brick removal have altered the site. It is possible that a garden structure once stood in an area now destroyed or still buried. This position emphasizes caution in dismissing ancient testimony too quickly. The second position suggests that the gardens existed, but not in Babylon. This is the Nineveh hypothesis. Proponents point to Sennacherib's inscriptions, the Jerwan aqueduct, and reliefs depicting terraced royal gardens. They argue that later, Greek writers may have confused Assyrian achievements with Babylonian identity. This interpretation attempts to reconcile literary consistency with stronger northern archaeological evidence. It does not deny the garden's existence, it relocates it. A third position holds that the gardens may have been real but exaggerated. In this view, a royal garden in Babylon, perhaps elevated modestly or integrated into palace terraces, was gradually magnified in description through centuries of retelling. What began as an impressive but not unprecedented landscaping project could have evolved into a monumental wonder in the literary imagination. Ancient writers often amplified scale when describing distant lands. A garden raised a few meters above ground could, in retelling, become a towering structure touching the sky. This position treats exaggeration as a normal feature of long-distance reporting rather than as deliberate fabrication. The fourth position is more skeptical. Some historians argue that the Hanging Gardens may be entirely legendary, a product of accumulated misunderstanding and symbolic storytelling. They note the absence of direct Babylonian documentation and the lack of clear archaeological remains. In this interpretation, the gardens represent a literary ideal of Eastern opulence rather than a specific structure. This view does not accuse ancient writers of dishonesty. Instead, it recognizes that marvels often crystallize around fragments of reality, shaped by imagination and repetition. What is striking is that none of these positions rests on conclusive proof. Each weighs the same limited data set differently. Scholars evaluate literary transmission, archaeological gaps, engineering feasibility, and regional comparisons. Their conclusions vary because the evidence itself remains incomplete. In modern academic writing, the most common tone is cautious agnosticism. Many researchers describe the gardens as unconfirmed. They acknowledge the strength of classical testimony while admitting the absence of decisive physical corroboration. This careful language reflects a broader principle in historical inquiry. Uncertainty, when evidence is incomplete, is not weakness, but intellectual honesty. At this point in our investigation, the Hanging Gardens occupy a category that is neither firmly historical nor purely mythical. They are a case where documentation exists without direct confirmation. The next step is to examine why the idea of a suspended garden resonated so powerfully across cultures, regardless of its physical status. Understanding that resonance may explain why the tradition endured even when material evidence remained elusive. Even if the physical structure remains uncertain, the idea of the Hanging Gardens possessed unusual symbolic strength. To understand why the tradition endured, we must consider what a terraced, irrigated garden represented in the ancient imagination. Mesopotamia was a land defined by rivers, but surrounded by arid zones. Agriculture depended on careful management of water. Fertility was never taken for granted. In such an environment, a garden was not merely decorative. It was evidence of control over nature's unpredictability. Royal gardens, whether in Assyria or Babylonia, symbolized order imposed upon chaos. They demonstrated that a king could command water to flow where he desired, could transplant trees from distant mountains, and could sustain greenery in a hot climate. In inscriptions, rulers described planting orchards filled with species gathered from conquered lands. These gardens embodied imperial reach. They were living maps of power. To Mediterranean observers encountering accounts of such landscapes, the image carried an additional layer of wonder. Greek writers often contrasted their own terrain with the perceived exoticism of the East. A lush garden rising above a Mesopotamian city, fed by engineered water systems, suggested a reversal of expectation. It transformed a river plain into something resembling mountainous terrain. It combined architecture with vegetation. Unlike a statue or temple, which remained static, a garden changed with seasons and growth. Its vitality may have made it seem more extraordinary. The vertical dimension also mattered. Terraces implied elevation. In many cultures, height signifies closeness to the divine. Mesopotamian ziggurats rose in stepped levels toward the sky, symbolizing sacred ascent. A garden arranged in ascending layers might echo that visual language, blending sacred architecture with cultivated abundance. Whether the gardens were literal terraces or later exaggerations, the image harmonized with existing architectural traditions in the region. Symbolism alone does not create a wonder, but it reinforces its appeal. A monument that captures multiple themes, engineering skill, imperial wealth, environmental transformation, has greater narrative durability. Even if specific details shifted over centuries, the core concept remained compelling. A king building greenery into the sky embodied mastery. In literary traditions, such mastery invites admiration. This symbolic resonance helps explain why the Hanging Gardens maintained their place among the Seven Wonders despite uncertain physical evidence. The wonder was not only about bricks and irrigation channels, it was about what those elements signified. A terraced garden represented the triumph of planning over climate, order over disorder, cultivation over wilderness. These themes cross cultural boundaries easily. As manuscripts traveled from Greek to Latin to Arabic to modern languages, the symbolic meaning traveled with them. At this stage, the investigation begins to move beyond technical feasibility and textual transmission into the deeper relationship between memory and meaning. Even if archaeology cannot yet confirm the garden's precise form or location, the persistence of its image reveals something about how human societies choose to remember the past. The question now becomes not only whether the gardens existed, but why certain monuments, real or uncertain, acquire a permanence that resists doubt. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the search for the Hanging Gardens has expanded beyond trenches and visible ruins. Archaeology no longer depends solely on digging. It increasingly relies on aerial photography, satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and environmental analysis. These tools allow researchers to study landscapes at scale, tracing ancient riverbeds, canal systems, and buried architectural outlines without disturbing the ground. In regions like Mesopotamia, where watercourses have shifted repeatedly over millennia, such methods are especially important. The Euphrates River has altered its path since antiquity. Sediment accumulation, erosion, and human intervention have reshaped the terrain around Babylon. Understanding these changes is essential when evaluating where a large, irrigated structure might once have stood. Remote sensing has revealed patterns of ancient canals radiating outward from major cities. In both Babylon and Nineveh, researchers have mapped extensive hydraulic networks that supported agriculture and urban life. These findings confirm what inscriptions already suggest. Mesopotamian rulers invested heavily in water management. In the region around Nineveh, satellite surveys have traced remnants of Sennacherib's canal system across long distances, reinforcing the scale of his engineering projects. Such mapping strengthens the argument that northern Mesopotamia possessed the infrastructure capable of sustaining elaborate royal gardens. At Babylon, however, the situation is more complicated. Portions of the site were excavated in the early 20th century, but political instability and modern construction have limited continuous research. Some areas remain inaccessible. Others were disturbed by earlier, less precise excavation techniques. Modern archaeological standards emphasize careful stratigraphy and environmental sampling, yet opportunities to apply these methods extensively at Babylon have been uneven. As a result, certain questions remain open simply because the ground has not been fully examined with contemporary tools. Environmental archaeology also contributes new perspectives. By analyzing pollen samples, soil composition, and plant remains, researchers can sometimes reconstruct past vegetation patterns. In some ancient sites, concentrated pollen deposits have revealed the presence of orchards or cultivated gardens. To date, no pollen evidence at Babylon has definitively confirmed a large, elevated garden of the type described by classical authors. This absence is informative, though it does not conclusively rule out smaller or differently structured gardens that left subtler traces. Technology has also refined dating methods. Radiocarbon analysis and improved ceramic chronologies allow scholars to establish more precise timelines for construction phases. These tools help distinguish Assyrian layers from Babylonian ones, clarifying which structures belong to which empire. As dating becomes more accurate, it becomes easier to test whether a particular building aligns chronologically with Nebuchadnezzar II or Sennacherib. What emerges from modern technological investigation is not a dramatic revelation, but gradual refinement. No satellite image has revealed a hidden terraced platform clearly matching the wonder of classical description. No subsurface scan has uncovered unmistakable, multi-level garden foundations. Yet the expanded view of Mesopotamian hydraulic systems confirms that ambitious water engineering was real and widespread. The Hanging Gardens remain unconfirmed, but the broader environmental context grows clearer. Each new method sharpens the boundaries of what can and cannot be demonstrated. As research continues, the question becomes more focused. If a monumental garden once existed, what specific physical signature would we expect it to leave, and why has that signature not yet been found? Archaeology does not take place in isolation from modern history. The ruins of Babylon and Nineveh lie within present-day Iraq, a region that has experienced repeated political upheaval over the past century. These realities have shaped what researchers have been able to investigate, preserve, and publish. When considering why the Hanging Gardens have not been definitively identified, it is necessary to acknowledge not only ancient uncertainties, but also modern limitations. Early excavations at Babylon, including those led by Robert Calderway, occurred under Ottoman rule and later during the period of the British Mandate. These projects were ambitious for their time, yet archaeological methods were still developing. Detailed stratigraphic recording, environmental sampling, and systematic conservation were not always prioritized according to modern standards. Some areas were cleared quickly to expose monumental architecture, potentially disturbing smaller or subtler features that might have yielded clues about garden installations. Later, in the 20th century, access to key sites became irregular. Political instability, wars, and economic sanctions limited sustained international collaboration. Excavation campaigns were paused, resumed, and sometimes halted again. Conservation of previously uncovered structures became a challenge in itself. Exposed mud brick deteriorates rapidly without maintenance. When attention shifts away from preservation, valuable evidence can erode. In the case of Babylon, parts of the ancient site were also affected by modern construction initiatives that altered or rebuilt certain sections. These interventions, though often intended to promote heritage tourism, complicated archaeological interpretation by mixing ancient remains with contemporary materials. Nineveh faced similar challenges. Portions of the site near modern Mosul were damaged during periods of conflict. In recent decades, looting and destruction have further threatened archaeological layers that might have preserved environmental or architectural traces. While major Assyrian reliefs and inscriptions had already been removed to museums in the 19th century, the surrounding landscape continues to hold information that is difficult to recover under unstable conditions. These constraints do not imply that decisive evidence once existed and was lost. Rather, they highlight the practical difficulty of conducting continuous, large-scale research in regions affected by modern conflict. Archaeology requires time, funding, and secure access. Without these, projects proceed slowly and often focus on conservation rather than exploratory excavation. It is also important to recognize that even in stable environments, identifying a garden archaeologically is inherently complex. Unlike stone temples or massive walls, gardens are composed largely of organic materials. Soil layers shift, wood decays, irrigation channels may be reused or filled in. Unless a garden includes distinctive structural subcomponents, such as large vaulted terraces, it may leave only subtle traces. Detecting those traces requires careful sampling and long-term study. In reflecting on these modern challenges, the question of the Hanging Gardens becomes less about dramatic discovery and more about patient accumulation of evidence. The absence of confirmation may reflect incomplete access as much as ancient uncertainty. As stability and technological resources gradually improve, researchers continue to reassess both Babylon and Nineveh with renewed caution. The next stage of inquiry must consider what kind of material signature would truly settle the debate, and whether such a signature is realistically recoverable after more than 2.5 millennia. To determine what would truly confirm the existence of the Hanging Gardens, we must first imagine what kind of evidence a structure like that would leave behind. Ancient monuments endure when they are built from durable materials and anchored in deep foundations. Stone walls, baked bricks, inscribed cylinders, and carved reliefs survive because they resist decay. A terraced garden, however, combines architecture with living systems. Its most visible feature, vegetation, disappears quickly once maintenance ends. Trees die, roots decay, soil erodes or is reused. What remains is not the greenery itself, but whatever structural framework once supported it. If the classical descriptions are accurate in speaking of massive vaulted terraces, then we would expect to find substantial substructures, thick, load-bearing walls, waterproofing layers, perhaps traces of bitumen or lead sheeting consistent with prolonged irrigation. We would also expect a nearby water source integrated into the design, such as channels, lifting mechanisms, or reservoirs capable of sustaining continuous flow upward. Ideally, we would find an inscription explicitly associating such a structure with royal construction, naming a king and describing the garden's purpose. That combination, architectural remains, hydraulic systems, and textual confirmation, would create convergence strong enough to resolve most doubt. At present, no site in Babylon or Nineveh provides all of these elements together in an unmistakable form. Babylon offers impressive palace complexes and known canal systems, but no clearly identified terraced garden foundation accompanied by dedicatory text. Nineveh offers documented aqueducts and artistic depictions of gardens, yet no surviving inscription describes a wonder equivalent to the later Greek accounts in scale and language. The archaeological record, therefore, remains suggestive rather than decisive. It is also necessary to consider survival probability. Mesopotamian architecture relied heavily on mud brick, a material vulnerable to erosion if not continuously maintained. After abandonment, even large mud brick platforms can collapse and merge into surrounding soil over centuries. Waterproofing layers, if present, might fragment beyond recognition. Reuse of bricks in later construction common in the region could dismantle upper terraces entirely. River migration further complicates matters. If portions of ancient Babylon now lie beneath altered floodplains, structural traces may be deeply buried or damaged beyond clear interpretation. For this reason, some historians caution that definitive proof may never emerge, not because the gardens were imaginary, but because the type of structure described is archaeologically fragile. Others counter that if the monument were truly as large and engineered as classical texts suggest, more substantial remains should be identifiable. The debate returns again to scale. How monumental were these gardens in reality? If modest, their traces might be subtle. If vast, their absence becomes more striking. In assessing what evidence would settle the question, we confront a broader truth about ancient history. Some uncertainties persist not from lack of effort, but from the limits of preservation. The soil does not record everything equally. Even without final confirmation, however, the investigation itself reveals the complexity of reconstructing the past. The hanging gardens remain suspended not only in imagination, but in the narrow space between what the earth has yielded and what it may never yield again. By the time modern scholars began questioning the physical reality of the Hanging Gardens, the monument had already achieved something more enduring than stone. It had become an idea. For more than 2 millennia, the gardens existed in educational texts, travel literature, artistic renderings, and popular imagination. They appeared in school lessons about the ancient world. They were painted in grand 19th-century canvases as cascading greenery above desert walls. They were described in encyclopedias as confidently as the pyramids of Egypt. This endurance invites a deeper question. How does an idea gain the weight of reality across centuries? Authority plays a central role. When respected ancient writers record a marvel, later generations inherit not only the description, but the credibility attached to those names. Diodorus, Siculus, Strabo, and others were not anonymous storytellers. They were part of a recognized intellectual tradition. Their works were preserved, studied, and cited. Once the Hanging Gardens entered that chain of citation, repetition reinforced acceptance. A reader encountering the same monument described by multiple authors may assume independent confirmation, even if those authors relied on shared earlier sources. Over time, Consistency of reference can substitute for direct verification. Cultural need also contributes to permanence. Civilizations often seek symbols that represent human ingenuity and aspiration. The Seven Wonders list functioned as a compact narrative of achievement. Each monument illustrated a different dimension of mastery: height, scale, artistry, engineering. The Hanging Gardens added a distinctive element: the shaping of living nature into architecture. Removing them from the list would leave an absence not only in historical record but in cultural symmetry. As a result, questioning their existence can feel disruptive, as though challenging a familiar landmark of collective memory. Imagination further strengthens belief. Visual representations of the gardens have multiplied over centuries. Renaissance and modern artists depicted sweeping terraces draped in foliage. Even though these images were speculative, they gave the monument shape. Once visualized repeatedly, the garden acquired architectural solidity in the public mind. People remember images more readily than footnotes. The illustration can feel more concrete than the uncertainty expressed in scholarly articles. Yet permanence in memory does not automatically translate into permanence in earth. The Hanging Gardens illustrate how cultural memory can outlast material confirmation. An idea repeated across generations gains momentum. It becomes embedded in education, tourism, and shared narratives of the past. Even as archaeologists express caution, the image remains familiar and compelling. At this stage in our inquiry, the gardens stand as an example of how history is constructed not only through excavation but through transmission. The physical question, did such a structure stand in Babylon or Nineveh, remains open. The cultural question, why the garden endured so powerfully, reveals the mechanisms by which human societies transform uncertainty into tradition. To continue, we must examine how modern media, museums, and education systems have shaped contemporary perceptions of the Hanging Gardens, often presenting them with more certainty than the evidence allows. In modern classrooms, the Seven Wonders of the ancient world are often introduced as a fixed list, presented with confidence and clarity. Students memorize the names. Textbooks display illustrations. The Hanging Gardens appear alongside the Great Pyramid and the Lighthouse of Alexandria, as though all share equal archaeological certainty. In many cases, only a brief footnote mentions the ongoing debate about their existence. This pattern reveals how educational framing shapes perception. When a monument is consistently grouped with confirmed structures, it inherits an aura of equal solidity. Museums and documentaries contribute to this effect. Exhibitions about Mesopotamia frequently highlight Babylon's grandeur, its walls, its gates, its palaces. Within that broader narrative, the Hanging Gardens often appear as a natural extension of the city's splendor. Visual reconstructions, whether digital or painted, show terraces layered with trees and flowing water. These reconstructions are typically labeled as artistic interpretations, yet repeated exposure can blur the distinction between interpretation and evidence. The human mind tends to treat detailed imagery as confirmation. Modern media amplifies this tendency. Television programs and online articles sometimes present the gardens with dramatic language, emphasizing mystery while still implying physical reality. Headlines may ask whether they have been found or lost, framing the issue as a treasure hunt awaiting resolution. While such approaches generate interest, they can oversimplify the careful balance maintained in academic research. Scholars rarely claim certainty where evidence is incomplete. Public narratives, however, often favor definitive statements. This gap between scholarly caution and popular presentation does not arise from deception. It reflects different goals. Education and media aim to engage broad audiences. Clear stories are easier to teach than nuanced uncertainty. Yet this clarity can create the impression that the gardens are confirmed historical fact rather than an open question. As a result, when modern readers encounter academic debates, they may feel surprised that doubt exists at all. Another factor is the influence of visual culture. Architectural renderings of the gardens have become iconic. From 19th-century engravings to contemporary digital animations, the image of cascading greenery has been refined repeatedly. Each generation updates the aesthetic according to its own tastes, but the core image remains consistent. Over time, repetition strengthens plausibility. The garden becomes familiar, and familiarity often feels like truth. At the same time, modern scholarship increasingly emphasizes transparency about uncertainty. Many historians now describe the Hanging Gardens as unconfirmed or possibly misplaced. Academic articles carefully outline competing theories rather than declaring resolution. This approach may lack dramatic appeal, but it reflects a commitment to evidence-based interpretation. The coexistence of confident imagery and cautious scholarship illustrates the tension at the heart of the Hanging Gardens question. In public imagination, the monument stands vividly above Babylon's skyline. In academic discussion, it remains suspended between possibility and doubt. To understand why this tension persists, we must consider how authority, repetition, and narrative simplicity interact with the deeper human desire for coherent stories about the past. Human beings are naturally drawn to coherent stories. When fragments of information appear scattered or uncertain, the mind seeks patterns that connect them. This tendency shapes not only daily perception but also historical memory. The Hanging Gardens provide a clear example. We possess literary descriptions, archaeological ruins, engineering evidence from related cultures, and centuries of repetition. These pieces do not align perfectly, yet the human impulse is to assemble them into a single, satisfying narrative. A king builds a magnificent terraced garden for his queen. Water rises against gravity, visitors marvel, and the wonder enters history. The story feels complete. Completeness has emotional appeal. Uncertainty does not. Cognitive psychology suggests that repetition increases perceived truth. When a claim is heard multiple times across trusted sources, it becomes easier to process mentally. Ease of processing often feels like accuracy. Over centuries, the Hanging Gardens were described in respected texts, taught in schools, illustrated in art, and included in canonical lists. Each repetition reduced friction. Even if the underlying evidence remained thin, the narrative became smooth. Smooth narratives are rarely questioned unless new evidence disrupts them. Another psychological factor involves scale and contrast. A garden rising above a desert landscape creates a powerful visual contrast. It dramatizes human ingenuity, overcoming environmental limits. Stories built around contrast are memorable. They travel easily across cultures because they express universal themes: longing for home, mastery over nature, the ambition of rulers. The detail often repeated that the garden was built to comfort a queen who missed her mountainous homeland adds emotional texture. Whether historically verifiable or not, such details humanize vast empires. Humanized narratives endure longer than technical reports. There is also comfort in canonical lists. The Seven Wonders offer a manageable framework for understanding ancient achievement. 7 monuments can be remembered. They provide structure to what might otherwise feel like overwhelming historical complexity. Within that structure, each wonder plays a role. Removing one destabilizes the symmetry. Faced with uncertainty, people often prefer preserving the familiar outline rather than revising it. This does not mean belief in the gardens is irrational. It means that historical memory operates under psychological influences as much as evidentiary ones. Scholars trained to separate narrative appeal from proof must actively resist the pull of coherence. They ask where the evidence converges and where it does not. Yet outside academic settings, narrative cohesion often prevails. The Hanging Gardens endure partly because they satisfy a desire for balance in the story of ancient civilizations. They represent the cultivated oasis among pyramids and statues. They embody life within architecture. As our investigation continues, the focus shifts again, from psychology back to historical responsibility. If uncertainty persists, how should it be presented? How do historians communicate doubt without diminishing wonder? The answer to that question may define the most important truth about the Hanging Gardens, not whether they stood in brick and soil, but how we choose to speak about them today. In modern historical scholarship, responsibility begins with clarity about evidence. When discussing the Hanging Gardens, careful historians distinguish between what is documented, what is plausible, and what remains uncertain. This distinction is not intended to diminish fascination. It is meant to preserve trust. The ancient world is filled with genuine achievements, monuments, whose remains still rise above the ground. Placing the Hanging Gardens within that context requires intellectual precision. Scholars therefore describe the gardens as attested in classical literature but unconfirmed archaeologically. That phrasing may sound cautious, yet it reflects a deliberate effort to separate literary tradition from material verification. Responsible communication also avoids replacing one certainty with another. For example, the Nineveh hypothesis offers compelling engineering evidence, but most researchers present it as a strong possibility rather than a settled conclusion. They outline Sennacherib's aqueducts, the relief depictions of terraced gardens, and the geographic confusion that may have occurred in transmission. At the same time, they acknowledge the absence of explicit classical references placing the wonder in Nineveh. This balanced approach resists the temptation to resolve ambiguity prematurely. Another element of responsible scholarship involves transparency about method. When historians weigh silence in Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions, they explain why that silence matters and why it does not prove absence conclusively. When archaeologists discuss the fragility of mud brick structures, they clarify how preservation biases shape what survives. By revealing the reasoning process, scholars allow readers to see how conclusions are formed. This openness strengthens credibility, especially in cases where definitive answers remain elusive. Public communication presents additional challenges. Simplified narratives attract attention, but oversimplification can distort understanding. Increasingly, museums and academic publications now label reconstructions clearly as interpretive. Digital models may illustrate how the gardens might have looked, while explicitly noting that such renderings are speculative. This practice maintains the imaginative dimension without presenting it as confirmed reality. In educational settings, some instructors use the Hanging Gardens as an example of how history is constructed, demonstrating how texts, archaeology, and interpretation interact. This approach turns uncertainty into a teaching tool rather than a weakness. It shows students that history is not static, but investigative. The case of the gardens becomes an opportunity to explain how evidence is evaluated and why conclusions sometimes remain provisional. At this stage in our inquiry, the Hanging Gardens stand not only as a question about ancient architecture, but as a reflection of modern intellectual ethics. How we present them reveals our commitment to evidence. To continue responsibly, we must now examine where current academic consensus rests, identifying what most scholars agree upon and where meaningful debate still persists. When examining the current academic landscape, it becomes clear that consensus exists in some areas, while uncertainty remains in others. Most scholars agree on several foundational points. First, the Hanging Gardens are described in multiple classical sources written centuries after the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II. These sources are consistent enough to demonstrate that the tradition was well established in the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. Second, no surviving Babylonian inscription explicitly confirms the existence of a monumental terraced garden matching the classical descriptions. Third, archaeology in both Babylon and Nineveh has revealed advanced water management systems and royal landscaping traditions, demonstrating that elaborate gardens were entirely within the technological capabilities of the region. Beyond these shared conclusions, debate begins. One area of disagreement concerns location. A significant number of researchers consider the traditional Babylonian setting plausible but unproven, emphasizing incomplete excavation and the possibility of lost structures. Others find the Assyrian evidence in Nineveh more persuasive, particularly given Sennacherib's detailed inscriptions about water engineering and palace gardens. This group argues that later geographic confusion may explain the classical attribution to Babylon. Neither position commands unanimous agreement. Another debated issue involves scale. Classical authors describe a massive, multi-tiered structure capable of supporting large trees. Some historians interpret these accounts as literal architectural descriptions. Others suspect exaggeration or misunderstanding, suggesting that the original garden, if it existed, may have been less monumental than later portrayals imply. In this interpretation, the wonder lies partly in literary amplification rather than purely in physical height. There is also discussion about the reliability of specific ancient authors. Scholars analyze how Diodorus, Strabo, and others compiled their information, examining whether they relied on a common lost source or independent reports. If their descriptions ultimately trace back to a single earlier narrative, the apparent agreement among them carries different weight than if they represent separate traditions. Textual analysis continues to refine these possibilities, though definitive answers remain elusive due to the fragmentary survival of ancient works. Despite these debates, the prevailing tone in contemporary scholarship is measured caution. Few academic publications present the Hanging Gardens as confirmed historical architecture in Babylon. Instead, they are often described as unverified, possibly misplaced, or legendary but rooted in real Near Eastern garden traditions. This phrasing reflects an effort to acknowledge the strength of literary testimony while recognizing the absence of decisive archaeological corroboration. What stands out most clearly is that the discussion remains active. The Hanging Gardens are not dismissed casually, nor are they accepted without qualification. They occupy a middle ground where evidence supports possibility but not certainty. In this middle ground, historians continue to compare texts, reassess excavations, and apply new technologies. The debate itself becomes part of the monument's story. To move toward our final axis, we must now step back from the technical details and ask what this enduring uncertainty teaches us about the nature of history itself. The enduring uncertainty surrounding the Hanging Gardens reveals something fundamental about the practice of history. History is not a fixed archive of unquestioned facts. It is a reconstruction built from fragments, texts copied by hand, ruins weathered by time, inscriptions broken or buried, landscapes reshaped by rivers and human activity. Some reconstructions rest on abundant, converging evidence. Others rest on thinner strands, sustained by tradition and repetition. The Hanging Gardens belong to the second category. They are neither pure invention nor securely confirmed monument. They exist at the edge where documentation fades and interpretation begins. One lesson emerges clearly: historical authority evolves. In antiquity, authority flowed from respected writers. If a historian of standing described a marvel, later generations repeated it. During the medieval period, authority flowed from preservation. If a text endured, its contents were treated with trust. In the modern era, authority depends increasingly on corroboration. Archaeology, environmental science, textual criticism, and engineering analysis must converge before certainty is claimed. The Hanging Gardens illustrate the tension between these models of authority. Literary consistency granted them centuries of acceptance. Material ambiguity now invites caution. Another lesson concerns the limits of evidence. Even the most advanced technologies cannot guarantee complete recovery of the past. Mud brick dissolves, timber decays, irrigation channels are reused or erased. Entire structures can vanish into sediment. The absence of a clear archaeological signature may reflect loss rather than non-existence. At the same time, responsible scholarship cannot substitute desire for proof. Between those two realities lies the careful balance historians attempt to maintain. The gardens also demonstrate how memory simplifies complexity. Mesopotamia was home to multiple empires, each constructing gardens, canals, and palaces. Over centuries, stories may have blended achievements across cities and rulers. A monument in Nineveh could be remembered under the name of Babylon. A modest garden could become monumental in retelling. Historical narratives often compress nuance into symbols. The Hanging Gardens became a symbol of Eastern magnificence, regardless of their precise physical form. Perhaps the most important insight is that uncertainty does not diminish value. The debate itself encourages closer examination of sources, technologies, and interpretive frameworks. It reminds us that history is an active inquiry rather than a closed ledger. In confronting the possibility that one of the seven wonders may never have stood as described, we are not losing a marvel, we are gaining awareness of how knowledge forms. As we approach the final axis, the question shifts once more. Beyond Babylon or Nineveh, beyond terraces and aqueducts, what does the persistence of this story tell us about the relationship between belief and evidence? And if a wonder can endure without confirmation, what responsibility do we carry when passing it to the next generation? At the beginning of this journey, we considered a quiet paradox. One of the seven wonders of the ancient world may never have existed in the form we imagine. After tracing ancient texts, excavations, engineering debates, translation shifts, and modern scholarship, that paradox remains unresolved. Yet it feels different now. It is no longer a dramatic claim. It is a measured possibility shaped by evidence and its limits. The Hanging Gardens stand before us not as a confirmed ruin, but as a question carefully examined from every available angle. If they stood in Babylon, they left no unmistakable architectural signature. If they stood in Nineveh, memory may have relocated them. If they were smaller than later descriptions suggest, storytelling may have amplified them. Each explanation carries weight. None closes the case entirely. This lingering uncertainty invites reflection rather than frustration. History often promises clarity, yet it frequently delivers probability. We speak confidently about Nebuchadnezzar's walls because bricks remain. We admire Sennacherib's aqueduct because stone still bears his name. With the gardens, however, we encounter a different category of past one preserved primarily through language. Words can endure longer than wood and soil. They can outlast cities. But words also evolve. They travel across languages and centuries, absorbing interpretation as they move. The Hanging Gardens remind us that historical knowledge is layered. At the base lies physical evidence. Above it stands literary testimony. Surrounding both is cultural memory. When these layers align, certainty grows. When they diverge, historians must tread carefully. In the case of the gardens, literary tradition is strong, archaeological confirmation is incomplete, and cultural memory is powerful. The result is not a failure of history, but an illustration of its complexity. There is also something instructive in the endurance of the image itself. For more than 2,000 years, people have imagined terraces of green rising above sunlit walls. Artists painted them. Writers described them. Teachers included them among humanity's greatest achievements. Even if the physical structure cannot be identified with confidence, the idea of shaping life upward, of raising water and planting trees against the horizon, has carried symbolic meaning across generations. The story endured because it expressed aspiration. As we move deeper into this final axis, the focus shifts from locating foundations to considering responsibility. What does it mean to inherit a story that may be partly uncertain? How should we balance admiration for ancient ingenuity with honesty about evidentiary limits? The answer to those questions may define the true lesson of the Hanging Gardens, not as architecture alone, but as a mirror reflecting how we construct the past. If there is an educational value in the story of the Hanging Gardens, it lies not in proving or disproving their existence, but in observing how evidence is weighed. The modern world is filled with information presented confidently. Claims circulate quickly. Images persuade instantly. Yet the investigation we have followed moves slowly. It pauses at each source. It asks who wrote it, when, and why. It compares text with material remains. It considers what has survived and what has vanished. In doing so, it models a way of thinking that extends far beyond ancient Mesopotamia. The gardens teach patience. They remind us that historical truth is often incremental. Excavations produce fragments. Inscriptions break off mid-sentence. Landscapes shift. Scholars build arguments not from certainty, but from probabilities. This method can feel unsatisfying to those who prefer decisive conclusions, yet it protects integrity. To admit uncertainty where evidence is incomplete is not weakness, it is discipline. The case also illustrates the importance of separating admiration from assumption. There is no need to diminish the engineering achievements of Babylon or Nineveh to acknowledge that one particular monument remains unconfirmed. Nebuchadnezzar's walls and Sennacherib's aqueducts stand as genuine accomplishments. Recognizing that a single wonder may be uncertain does not reduce the grandeur of the ancient Near East. Instead, it clarifies where our knowledge rests on stone and where it rests on narrative tradition. In this sense, the Hanging Gardens become a lesson in intellectual humility. They show that even long-accepted traditions deserve re-examination. They demonstrate how translation, repetition, and symbolism can amplify a story across centuries. They reveal how easily geographic identities can blur in memory. And they highlight how modern tools, archaeology, environmental science, textual criticism, continue refining our understanding without guaranteeing final answers. There is also a broader civic lesson. In any era, societies must decide how to handle uncertainty. One path is to ignore doubt and preserve comfortable narratives unchanged. Another is to question aggressively, dismissing traditions without careful review. Responsible historical thinking chooses a third path. Respect the sources, test them against evidence, and remain open to revision. The Hanging Gardens encourage this balanced approach. They invite curiosity without exaggeration. They allow wonder without surrendering rigor. As we approach the final moments of this exploration, the question shifts once more from architecture to mindset. If a monument can live for 2,000 years in text and imagination, sustained by repetition, yet challenged by evidence, what does that suggest about the way we construct certainty in our own time? We began with a quiet contradiction. A wonder of the ancient world may never have stood as we imagine it. After examining texts, ruins, translations, engineering systems, political shifts, and centuries of repetition, we arrive not at a dramatic revelation, but at a calm horizon of uncertainty. The Hanging Gardens remain suspended between earth and memory. Perhaps they rose above Babylon's palace walls, and time erased their foundations. Perhaps they flourished in Nineveh, later carried southward in story. Perhaps they were real but smaller, gradually elevated in description by distance and admiration. Or perhaps they were always a composite, an idealized vision drawn from genuine gardens, shaped into something grander through retelling. Each possibility carries fragments of evidence. None commands final authority. And yet the gardens endure. They endure not because stone confirms them, but because human beings preserved the image. Generations copied the words. Artists painted the terraces. Teachers repeated the list of wonders. The monument became part of how civilizations remembered themselves. In that sense, whether built of brick or of language, the gardens achieved permanence. There is something quietly instructive in that endurance. It reminds us that history is both discovery and interpretation. Some truths lie beneath the soil, waiting for careful excavation. Others live within documents, requiring patient reading, and sometimes the two do not fully meet. When that happens, the responsible response is not certainty, but balance. To hold admiration and doubt at the same time is not a failure of knowledge, it is maturity in understanding. The Hanging Gardens invite us to practice that maturity. They ask us to slow down, to consider how stories travel, how authority forms, how evidence accumulates or disappears. They encourage us to recognize that wonder does not depend entirely on confirmation. A civilization capable of building vast walls, carving intricate reliefs, and channeling rivers across dry plains did not need embellishment to be extraordinary. Whether the terraces rose as described or not, the ingenuity of Mesopotamia remains undeniable. As the image of green terraces fades gently into the distance, what remains is a quieter question. If a wonder can live for centuries, sustained by text and belief, balanced between possibility and proof, where else in history might we be standing on foundations made partly of memory